My fiancé, Ethan Walker, and I were both reborn in 1980. After his rebirth, Ethan brought his beloved, Autumn White, and her younger sister, Tina White, to his house 2 months earlier than in our previous lives. After they arrived, I immediately approached Ethan's parents to break off the engagement and return the engagement token. In my previous life, I had used marriage to trap Ethan for an entire lifetime. It wasn't until I was on my deathbed that I realized his heart had always belonged to Autumn. This time, I chose to step aside early, hoping that he and Autumn could have a long and loving relationship and that everything would go as they wished. Afterward, I successfully enrolled in college. Just a few days after I left, Ethan, who had found out about my acceptance letter, came searching for me like a madman. Holding the letter in my hands, I was overwhelmed with tears of joy. In my past life, I deeply loved Ethan, my military officer husband. I had believed he loved me as deeply as I loved him, so I gave up my opportunity to attend college to marry him. I bore his children, cared for his parents, managed the household, and eventually grew old and worn. Illness consumed me, and only on my deathbed did I learn that Ethan had long been secretly involved with Autumn White, the younger sister of one of his comrades. Ethan despised me for being a dull housewife, consumed by the mundane chores of life: rice, oil, salt, soy sauce, vinegar, and tea. In contrast, Autumn, a prestigious university graduate, was cultured, gentle, and had shared interests with him. Even the son I had given my all to raise looked down on me, ignoring my objections. He married Autumn's daughter, calling her mom with admiration and joy. Their family of 4 thrived in happiness, while I was left to struggle in pain at the edge of death. When Ethan learned I was dying, he seemed relieved. He had already begun planning his wedding with Autumn. On the day I passed, they were taking wedding photos at the best bridal shop in the city. When the news reached me, I took my last breath, filled with resentment. Looking back, my previous life was nothing short of a cruel joke. This time, I won't let myself become that joke. I will leave Ethan Walker and walk my own path. Carefully, I placed my college acceptance letter into my pocket and walked home. The sky was so blue, the sun so bright. Everything felt perfect. The joy of being reborn was indescribable. To celebrate, I bought groceries and returned to my small rented place to prepare a feast. While I was busy in the kitchen, I heard footsteps outside. Moments later, the door opened, and Ethan walked in with a large bag in his hand. He called out warmly, "Come in. From now on, treat this place as your home." Following his greeting, Autumn White gracefully walked in, holding Tina's hand. They glanced at me as I worked in the kitchen. Autumn smiled softly and said, "Tina and I will be troubling you and Ethan from now on." Surprised, I looked at Autumn and Tina. In my past life, Ethan hadn't brought them home until 2 months later. Why had it changed so much this time? Seeing my silence, Ethan frowned. "Autumn is talking to you. Why aren't you responding? Don't you have any manners?" I turned to look at Ethan, still young and handsome. His striking features had made me fall deeply in love with him in my past life, wasting decades in blind devotion. Now, I could see the dismissive tone and commanding expression he used toward me. So, he had begun to despise me this early. How blind I had been. I forced a small smile. "It's not that I'm ignoring Miss White. I just don't know how to respond. After all, this is your house, and I'm merely a guest here, just like her. So, it's not really a matter of being troubled or not." Hearing this, Ethan's expression darkened further. He glared at me before escorting Autumn and Tina upstairs to settle in. I stayed in the kitchen, calmly continuing to cook. Half an hour later, Ethan came downstairs with Autumn and Tina, glancing at the table where I had already placed several cooked dishes. He asked curtly, "Is the food ready?" "If it is, let's eat." 8-year-old Tina darted into the kitchen like a little monkey, quickly serving 3 bowls of rice and eagerly calling out, "Brother Ethan, come eat." Ethan courteously pulled out a chair for Autumn, displaying his gentlemanly manners. Ethan Walker didn't glance at me once throughout the meal. The 3 of them sat down, chatting and laughing as they started eating. Autumn White added a piece of meat to Ethan's bowl, and Ethan reciprocated by serving meat to both Autumn and her younger sister, Tina White. They completely ignored my presence, happily indulging in their feast. I watched coldly as Tina shoved a large chunk of meat into her mouth. The White sisters had lost their parents at a young age and had been raised by their uncle and aunt, who were rumored to be unkind. Life had been harsh for them, and having meat was a rare luxury. Seeing the large platter of meat on the table, Tina's eyes lit up with excitement. Drool almost escaped her lips as she quickly stuffed the meat from her bowl into her mouth and reached for more from the platter. However, just as Tina's chopsticks reached out, her eyes widened in shock. Her face turned bright red, and she spat out the meat she had just stuffed into her mouth. Ethan and Autumn weren't as frantic as Tina, but their faces turned crimson, their mouths gaping open as they gasped for air like dogs. Completely flustered, Ethan clamped a hand over his mouth and rushed into the kitchen to find water. Meanwhile, Autumn was both gasping for air and trying to comfort Tina, whose tears and snot were streaming uncontrollably. The scene was both ridiculous and revolting. After 10 chaotic minutes, the situation finally calmed down. Ethan returned to the dining area, his face dark with anger. He glared at me and demanded, "Susan Long, why did you put so many Sichuan peppercorns and chili in the meat? None of us eat spicy food. You did this on purpose, didn't you?" Autumn chimed in, her tone filled with accusation. "Susan, are you upset that Tina and I moved in? If that's the case, we don't want to cause any trouble between you and Ethan. Tina and I can leave." She put on an exaggeratedly pitiful expression, tears welling in her eyes as she held Tina's hand and made a show of preparing to leave. Ethan, of course, couldn't bear it and immediately stopped her. I stood there, watching their performance with a detached expression. Seeing my lack of reaction, Ethan grew furious and shouted at me, "Susan Long, what's wrong with you? Apologize to Autumn and Tina right now." I responded slowly, "Apologize for what? What did I do wrong? You deliberately made the food so spicy to target Autumn and Tina. Don't you think you owe them an apology?" Ethan snapped. I couldn't help but laugh at his words. "Ethan, that's ridiculous. Did you ever tell me Autumn and Tina were moving in? No, you didn't. So why would I have any reason to target them? Besides, I like spicy food. I can't eat without it. I made the food I like to eat. Who did that offend? If you can't eat spicy food, is that somehow my fault? You all have hands and feet. If you don't like what I cook, you're perfectly capable of making your own meals. That's just common sense, isn't it?" Ethan was momentarily speechless. He hadn't discussed bringing the White sisters to live here with me. He simply assumed I would naturally take on the role of a servant for them. But I was no longer the Susan Long from my past life, who lived only to please Ethan Walker. What he liked or didn't like was no longer my concern. Unable to find a valid argument, Ethan's frustration turned to fury. Autumn, playing the peacemaker, said gently, "Susan, it's understandable that you didn't know. It's not your fault. Just be more mindful next time." Her tone clearly implied she still expected me to act as their maid, catering to their every need. I let out a cold laugh. Let's make one thing clear. Whoever wants to eat can cook for themselves. I'm not anyone's maid or servant, and I have no habit of taking care of people who have nothing to do with me. I made no effort to soften my words, and Autumn's face turned pale with embarrassment. Ethan looked equally humiliated, his anger flaring as he stormed out with Autumn and Tina, saying they'd eat elsewhere. After they left, I dumped all the food they had touched into the trash. Then I returned to the kitchen to cook a new meal for myself. Yes, I had done it on purpose. I knew Ethan, Autumn, and Tina couldn't handle spicy food, so I deliberately made it extra spicy, salty, and numbing. I wasn't reborn to be anyone's doormat. Soon enough, Ethan Walker and Autumn White would realize that I wasn't someone they could push around anymore. After enjoying a delicious meal full of spicy, numbing flavors, I started thinking about what to do next. Since I had been given a second chance at life, I was determined not to repeat the mistakes of my previous one. I had to go to college, and if that was the case, my engagement to Ethan Walker could no longer stand. I needed to talk to his parents and officially end the arrangement. Ethan's family lived over 200 kilometers away from where we were staying. I decided to buy a bus ticket for the next day to make the trip and explain everything clearly. The bus station was a bit far from where we lived, so I walked there. After purchasing my ticket, I thought about buying some gifts for Ethan's parents. Mr. Walker and Mrs. Lee. As a gesture of goodwill, I headed to a nearby mall for that. To my surprise, I ran into Ethan, Autumn White, and Tina White. They were shopping for bedsheets and comforters. The salesperson at the bedding store noticed how well Ethan and Autumn matched in age and appearance, and assumed they were shopping for wedding items. She enthusiastically promoted bright red beddings embroidered with a phoenix and dragon, symbolizing a happy marriage. Autumn blushed but didn't deny it, nor did Ethan. In the end, Autumn chose a set of pink beddings, and Ethan paid for them. Ethan didn't notice me as he also bought candy for Tina. Overjoyed, Tina exclaimed, "Ethan, you're the best. Why is such a wonderful Ethan with someone as horrible as Susan Long? She doesn't deserve you at all." Ethan didn't stop Tina from insulting me, letting her badmouth me without a word of protest. It was Autumn who noticed me while I was browsing for local specialty products. She tugged on Tina's sleeve and whispered, "Don't talk nonsense. Susan is actually quite nice. She and Ethan seem well suited." "Well suited?" Tina sneered. "Ethan is handsome, kind, and even buys me candy. But Susan, just looking at her, you can tell she's a bad person. She deliberately made that awful spicy food to mess with us." Ethan coughed awkwardly. "What happened at lunch was Susan's fault. I apologize on her behalf. I'll talk to her when we get back. It won't happen again." "It's fine. Really," Autumn said gently, glancing in my direction before adding, "I'm just curious. Ethan, how did you and Susan end up together?" "How else?" Ethan sighed with a look of resignation. "It was an arranged marriage. Our parents decided it when we were kids." "An arranged marriage?" Autumn's eyes widened in surprise. "I thought you two were together by choice." "Not at all," Ethan replied dismissively. "Susan and I have nothing in common. If I could choose freely, I'd never pick someone with her personality." Hearing their conversation, I didn't feel angry. Instead, I chuckled inwardly. Ethan was right. Our engagement had indeed been arranged by our parents. My father and Mr. Walker had been comrades in arms, their bond unshakable. My mother and Mrs. Lee were also close friends. When they married, they made a pact. If they had a son and a daughter, they'd arrange for them to marry. If both were sons, they'd be brothers. If both were daughters, they'd be sisters. Thus, from the moment Ethan and I were born, our marriage was set. My parents exchanged engagement tokens with his parents. My family gave a jade pendant to Ethan, and his family gave me a jade bracelet. Since I was ending the engagement, I planned to return the bracelet in person and retrieve the pendant. If I wanted a clean break, I'd also need to move out of Ethan's house. After my father died heroically on a mission, my mother, devastated, passed away a few months later. I became an orphan, and Mr. Walker and Mrs. Lee took me in. I was grateful for their care. But over the past decade, I had never used a penny of their money. As the child of a martyr, I received a stipend, meaning I had my own funds. I wasn't worried about supporting myself after leaving Ethan. Right now, my top priority was to end the engagement. With the bus ticket already purchased, I planned to head back early tomorrow to discuss the matter with Mr. Walker and Mrs. Lee. Ethan had been my foolish choice in my past life. This time, I would take the initiative to let go. That evening, I had wontons at a small street stall for dinner. When I returned to the house, I could hear laughter and cheerful voices from a distance. Pushing the door open, I saw Ethan Walker and Autumn White in the kitchen, cooking together. They stood side by side, their movements harmonious. Autumn giggled playfully, occasionally tapping Ethan on the arm, while Ethan looked at her with a gentle smile. In both my past and present lives, I had never seen Ethan cook. He had always been someone who expected everything to be done for him. Meals prepared, clothes laid out. Even when I was unwell or suffering from stomach pain, he never once offered to cook for me. It was so obvious now. Love and indifference couldn't be more different. Hearing the sound of the door closing, both of them turned to look at me. Ethan instinctively stepped a little away from Autumn and said casually, "You're back. Dinner will be ready soon. Wash your hands and get ready to eat." I didn't respond, merely curling my lips into a faint smile before carrying the gifts I had bought into my room. Opening the door, I was stunned by the mess inside. My clothes and bedding had been thrown carelessly onto the floor, some of them bearing footprints and stains. My bedside table had been rummaged through, books and pens scattered everywhere. The worst of it all was seeing the photos of me with my parents, our precious family portraits, torn and lying on the floor with several rips. Standing in the middle of the chaos, proudly surveying her handiwork, was Tina White. She bared her teeth in a mocking smile, her expression full of defiance and disregard. My chest burned with anger. "Who gave you permission to enter my room?" I demanded. "Your room? This isn't your room," Tina shot back, her voice dripping with disdain. "This is Ethan's house, and you're the shameless one living here. Ethan already hates you. You're just too blind to see it." As she spoke, Tina picked up one of the photos of my parents. Seeing her hold it, I took a step forward and shouted, "Put that down right now." Tina ignored me, smirking as she deliberately tore a corner of the photo. Fury surged through me, and I lunged toward her. "Give it back. I'm warning you. Don't touch my photos." Tina made a mocking face at me, then suddenly let out a loud, ear-piercing wail. "Help! Susan Long is hitting me. She's hurting me. It hurts so much." As she screamed, she lunged at me, clawing and biting like a wild animal. Caught off guard, I felt a sharp pain as her teeth sank into my hand, drawing blood. Reacting instinctively, I pushed her away. She fell back hard, landing on the floor with a loud thud and wailing even louder. Hearing Tina's cries, Ethan and Autumn came rushing in. Seeing Tina sprawled on the floor, clutching her mouth and crying hysterically, Ethan's face darkened with rage. "What did you do? Susan, why would you hurt Tina? She's just a child." Autumn knelt beside Tina, cradling her in her arms. Tina sobbed uncontrollably, her mouth full of blood as she wailed, "My tooth. Susan Long knocked out my tooth." Seeing the blood in Tina's mouth, Ethan became frantic. He turned to me, yelling angrily, "How could you be so cruel? She's just a kid. And you did this to her? You're heartless." Ignoring his shouting, I bent down and carefully picked up the torn pieces of my parents' photos. My hands trembled as I wiped them clean, trying to piece them back together. Meanwhile, Autumn held Tina, crying pitifully, her voice trembling. "She's just my little sister. She's so young. And now she's lost her tooth. Susan, you're so cruel. If you didn't want us to stay, you could have just said so. Why would you hurt an 8-year-old? Ethan, torn between comforting Autumn and glaring at me, shook his head in disappointment. "Susan Long, I never thought you could be this kind of person. You've really let me down. I'm telling you, you need to apologize to Tina and beg for her forgiveness. Otherwise..." "Otherwise what?" I interrupted, raising my bloodied hand in front of Ethan's face. "Are you blind, Ethan? Or just willfully ignoring the truth? Did you not see what my room looks like? Look at the mess she made. Look at what she did to my things. Look at this." Ethan faltered as his eyes fell on my hand, which was still dripping with blood. His anger wavered, and he suddenly found himself at a loss for words. "Tina's just a child. It's natural for children to act out. If the room's a mess, you can clean it up," Ethan Walker said defensively. I let out a cold laugh. "Then tell me, what do I do about this?" I held up the torn photograph. "This is the only picture I have of my parents. What am I supposed to do about that?" Ethan continued defending Tina. "She didn't do it on purpose. Tina doesn't know any better. She accidentally tore it. You didn't have to go so far." I shot back. "Ethan, do you seriously believe I knocked out Tina's tooth? If that's the case, let's go to the hospital right now and get an exam. Let's see if she really lost her tooth because I hit her, or if there's another explanation behind her bloody mouth." My words silenced everyone. Tina and Autumn White stopped talking, and even Ethan fell quiet. Having grown up with me, he knew what kind of person I was. The room fell into an uneasy silence as I glared at the White sisters coldly. "Let's go," I said firmly. "We're going to the hospital." Autumn panicked. "That's not necessary. We don't need you to apologize. Let's just leave it at that." "Leave it at that?" I echoed mockingly. "So I'm just supposed to let it go after your sister bit me and tore apart my room? If you were in my shoes, would you leave it at that? And what about the things I might be missing? Who do I talk to about that?" I crossed my arms, my tone cutting. "Let me make this clear. There's money in my room. If anything's missing, Someone's going to have to answer for it. Autumn's face turned pale, and she began trembling with anger. Are you accusing us of being thieves? How dare you? Susan, you're the one bullying us. Her teary eyes immediately drew Ethan's sympathy. He frowned at me, his voice disapproving. Susan, that's enough. You're being too aggressive. I sneered, stepping forward and grabbing Tina's sleeve. Reaching into her pocket, I pulled out a handful of large banknotes. What's this? I asked, holding the money up for everyone to see. Don't tell me this is yours. You don't look like someone who would have money like this. The sight of the cash left Ethan, Autumn, and Tina stunned. The White sisters had always cried poverty, claiming they were on the brink of starvation. Where could they have gotten this kind of money if not from me? Caught red-handed, Autumn's face burned with shame. In front of everyone, she slapped Tina hard across the face. Who told you to steal money? Who taught you to behave like this? Didn't I tell you that even if we starve, we never take a penny that doesn't belong to us? Oh, what noble morals! I remarked sarcastically. So you wouldn't take a penny, but a few dozen dollars is fair game? Great lessons you're teaching. Ms. White. Autumn's face was flushed with humiliation as she hugged Tina, both of them sobbing uncontrollably. They left in tears. And Ethan, of course, chased after them. I took the opportunity to clean up my room, putting everything back in order. As I lay down on my bed, I reassured myself, just endure a little longer. Once I end this engagement, I'll move out, and all of this will be behind me. Ethan didn't return until the middle of the night, after spending hours coaxing the White sisters to come back. When he finally came home, he knocked on my door. Susan, I brought some antiseptic. Let me clean your wound. He'd been gone for 4 or 5 hours. If my wound were going to get infected, it would have already started by now. Ignoring him, I pulled the blanket over my head. Ethan lingered outside the door for a while before knocking again. I know you're not asleep. Can we talk? He asked softly. I knew exactly what he wanted to say. He would ask me to be magnanimous, to let bygones be bygones, and to forgive the White sisters. But after everything I had been through in my previous life, did he really think I'd fall for their tricks again? No. I knew these sisters too well. In my past life, after Ethan and I got married, they practically moved into our home. Autumn went off to college in the capital, while Tina stayed behind, sticking to me like a leech. I had taken care of Tina White as if she were my own younger sister. People often say that kindness begets kindness. I had naively believed that my care for Tina would make her treat me well in return. But that wasn't the case. Tina was lazy, gluttonous, and prone to lying. Whenever Ethan Walker returned from the military or Autumn White came back from college, Tina would slander me relentlessly. She claimed I abused her, refused to cook for her, wouldn't wash her clothes, and even hit her regularly. In my past life, I dismissed her accusations, thinking she was just a child who didn't know any better. But living through it a second time, I realized the truth. Some people are born rotten. Tina's wickedness, like Autumn's, was etched into her very bones. I had no intention of provoking the White sisters or seeking revenge on them, but that didn't mean I would allow myself to be trampled on. If they behaved and kept to themselves, I would quietly break off the engagement and leave, allowing Autumn and Ethan to be together. However, if they continued to act out, they shouldn't blame me for fighting back. I had endured an entire lifetime of mistreatment, and in this life, I would not tolerate it again. If anyone tried to harm me, I would repay them 100-fold. The next morning, I woke to find that the White sisters weren't home. Ethan had bought breakfast and eagerly invited me to sit down and eat. Silently, I took a seat and picked up a bun. Biting into it, Ethan's gaze lingered on me, and when he saw my cold demeanor and reluctance to speak to him, he finally broke the silence. "Does your hand still hurt?" he asked. I let out a cold laugh. "Why don't you let someone bite you and find out for yourself?" Ethan was visibly uncomfortable with my new attitude, so different from the Susan he used to know. He hesitated before speaking again. "Listen, Susan, I only wanted to help Autumn and Tina because they don't have anyone else. Their parents are gone, and their uncle and aunt abused them. I just couldn't stand by and do nothing. There are plenty of people in the world who need help," I said, fixing him with a sharp look. "Why them? Why not anyone else?" Ethan faltered, clearly not expecting my question. His face darkened, but he forced himself to hold back his frustration. After a moment of silence, he said, "If you're worried about us, we could get married first. We can register our marriage right away." His suggestion made me look up at him in disbelief. "Ethan, are you sure you want to marry me? Are you absolutely certain you won't regret it?" Ethan was momentarily stunned, caught off guard by my direct question. After a long pause, he said, "We've been promised to each other since we were kids. So, you feel obligated to marry me because of some childhood arrangement?" I interrupted. "Ethan, times have changed. People pursue love freely now. Our so-called engagement is nothing more than an outdated tradition. You don't need to force yourself to keep a promise you don't want to keep." I had laid it out as clearly as possible, hoping he would understand and agree to end the engagement. That way, we could simply inform his parents and be done with it. But instead of following my lead, Ethan surprised me by saying, "Susan, you're my wife. That won't change. Not in this life. Or any other." I almost laughed at his words. He had already invited the White sisters into the house, practically giving them the run of the place. And yet he still had the audacity to tell me such blatant lies. Looking back, it wasn't surprising that I had been deceived in my previous life. I had been too blind, too foolish, to see the truth. I couldn't understand why Ethan was so insistent on marrying me. The memory of my previous life, of lying on my deathbed while he and Autumn posed for wedding photos, fueled my hatred. If he wanted to pretend, I would let him, but I had no intention of staying tied to him. Shifting the topic, I said, "I'm planning to visit your parents, Mr. Walker and Mrs. Lee." Ethan looked slightly taken aback. "I've been busy lately, so I might not have time to go with you." "That's fine. I've already bought my ticket. I'm leaving today." Ethan stared at me, visibly surprised. After a long pause, he said, "I'll drive you to the station." In the end, Ethan didn't take me to the station. He was called away by Autumn, who was crying and begging for his attention. I headed to the bus station without much emotion. A few hours later, I found myself sitting in the living room of Ethan Walker's parents' home, carrying the gifts I had bought for them. When I brought up the topic of ending my engagement with Ethan, Mr. Walker and Mrs. Lee were visibly shocked. "Why?" Mr. Walker asked. "Did Ethan do something to upset you?" "No," I replied. "It's just that I don't want to get married so soon. I want to go to college, gain knowledge, serve my country, and become someone as capable as my father was." The two exchanged glances, doubt written all over their faces. They weren't entirely unaware of Ethan's actions. Mr. Walker's expression darkened, and he asked bluntly, "Is this about that girl, Autumn White?" "No, Mr. Walker," I said firmly. "This is entirely my decision. I'm sorry, but I can't fulfill the engagement with Ethan. Please, I ask for your understanding and agreement." Seeing my resolute attitude, they reluctantly agreed to the dissolution of the engagement. I returned the jade bracelet they had given me, and Mrs. Lee handed back the jade pendant my family had given Ethan. Both of them assured me that they would always be my support, no matter what. I felt a deep sense of gratitude toward them. Reflecting on my past life, I realized that Ethan had only agreed to marry me due to the pressure from his parents. Now, I had set things right, and this chain of events would not repeat. With the engagement officially annulled, I stayed at their house for another week before returning. My bus was delayed, and I didn't arrive back at the shared residence until nearly 11 p.m. The house was pitch dark when I entered. Not wanting to disturb anyone at such a late hour, I moved quietly, tiptoeing up the stairs to my room. But as I approached the door, I heard an unusual noise coming from inside. It was clearly a woman's voice. My room? How could there be a woman's voice coming from my room? I immediately pushed the door open and flipped on the light. The scene before me made my blood boil. On my bed, Ethan Walker and Autumn White were entangled, holding each other tightly. At the sound of the door opening and the sudden flood of light, Ethan scrambled upright, startled. He looked at me standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock. "Susan," he stammered, but then glanced at Autumn, still in his arms. Panicking, he shoved her off the bed. Caught off guard, Autumn fell to the floor with a thud. Instead of helping her, Ethan turned his focus to me, stammering nervously. What's going on? Autumn, why are you in Susan's room? I crossed my arms and regarded them coldly. That's a question you should be asking yourselves. If you wanted to do something like this, why not use your own room? Did you think doing it in mine would make it more exciting? At my words, Autumn burst into tears, shaking her head vehemently. It's not what it looks like. It's not like that. Ethan joined in, hastily trying to explain. Susan, this isn't what you think. My bedding was soaked earlier because Tina spilled water on it, and I couldn't sleep. Since you weren't home, I thought I'd use your room for the night. I must have fallen asleep and thought I was dreaming. Is that so? I asked with a mocking smile. Then how did she end up in my room? Don't tell me the bedding in her room was also soaked. So she came here instead. Autumn covered her face, her voice trembling. I accidentally walked into the wrong room. Her excuse was laughable, and it was clear even Ethan didn't fully believe her. Looking at the two of them, disheveled and flustered, I couldn't help but sneer. Since things are already like this, why don't you two just get married? You clearly love each other so much, and I'd be more than happy to help make it happen. I expected Ethan to take the easy way out and agree. Instead, he surprised me again. This is just a misunderstanding, he protested. We didn't do anything. Susan, you have to believe me. There's no one else for me but you. I won't marry anyone else. I almost laughed at his audacity. He had already brought Autumn into our shared space, into my room no less, and yet he still dared to stand there and spout such blatant lies. In my past life, I'd been deceived, and now I could see why. I had been far too naive, too blind to recognize the truth. If he wanted to continue his charade, so be it, but I wasn't going to waste another moment on him. You are my one and only wife, Ethan Walker declared firmly. First, Autumn White's face lit up with a hopeful expression when she heard my sarcasm. But the moment Ethan rejected her, her face turned pale. You can't insult me like this, she shouted. I just walked into the wrong room. That's all. Tears streaming down her face. She dramatically ran toward the door as if to throw herself outside. I didn't stop her, in fact. I kindly opened the door for her. I wanted to see if this shameless woman would actually go through with her act of despair. Of course, Autumn wasn't going to. She had likely assumed either I or Ethan would stop her. But Ethan didn't even move from the bed. And I stood by with a look of detached amusement. With no one playing into her theatrics, Autumn froze, unsure of whether to stay or go. Just as her act seemed to falter, Tina White appeared, throwing herself at her sister and clutching her tightly, pulling her back from the edge. The two sisters clung to each other, crying miserably like characters in a tragic play. I watched the scene coldly. If I had known they'd stage such a melodrama tonight, I wouldn't have returned. I should have delayed my trip by another 2 days. What terrible timing. With this whole debacle, Autumn conveniently fell ill. She stayed in bed, refusing to get up or see a doctor. She simply lay there, feigning weakness. I had no idea what her endgame was, and frankly, I didn't care. It had nothing to do with me. I'd already annulled my engagement with Ethan Walker. Staying in the same house as him was no longer appropriate, so I decided to pack my things and leave. As I gathered my belongings, I overheard Tina crying downstairs, speaking to Ethan. Ethan, my sister refuses to eat. She says she'd rather die. What are we going to do? She's all I have left. If something happens to her, I won't be able to go on either. Ethan, naturally worried about his beloved Autumn, followed Tina to her room to comfort her. Through the walls, I could hear Autumn's hoarse cries. How am I supposed to live? I can't go on like this. Just let me die. Ethan's soothing words didn't calm her. Instead, she escalated her theatrics, once again threatening to end her life. As I continued packing, I kept an ear out for the drama. I wasn't sure what Ethan said to her, but eventually, the noise subsided. I figured he must have promised to marry her. Now that her wish was granted, she no longer had any reason to pretend. I was still packing when Ethan knocked on my door. I opened it just slightly, looking at him with a cold expression. What is it? I asked. Susan, we need to talk, he said. About what? I asked sarcastically. crossing my arms as I leaned against the doorframe. Ethan met my gaze but quickly looked away. Embarrassed. Susan, please don't look at me like that. Nothing happened between Autumn and me. Nothing happened? You two were lying in bed together. Ethan. And you're telling me nothing happened? We didn't go all the way, he protested. Susan, it was a mistake. Last night was just an accident. Thank goodness you came back when you did. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, so now it's my fault? I interrupted your plans. My mistake entirely. Susan, don't say that. It's not what you think. Autumn and I. Not what I think. I cut him off. You were lying in my bed, with the lights off, and your clothes half off. What were you doing? Having a philosophical discussion about the future. Ethan's face flushed red as he stammered. I told you. I thought it was you. I was dreaming, and I let myself go because I thought. Enough. I interrupted. Disgusted. Don't make me sick. Ethan. His face twisted as if he'd been deeply insulted. I swear to you, I'm telling the truth. If I'm lying, may lightning strike me where I stand. I rolled my eyes at his dramatic oath. Lightning? I didn't believe in such convenient divine punishment. If vows had any real power, Ethan wouldn't have gotten away with betraying me in my past life. He wouldn't have thrived, married the woman he'd always wanted, and lived happily after my death. As Ethan continued to try and explain, his persistence only exhausted me. I had no more patience for his lies. Your relationship with her doesn't concern me, I said coldly. You don't need to explain anything to me. I'm not interested. You're my fiancé. If you're not interested, who would be? Ethan Walker retorted. I responded with a derisive laugh, unwilling to be dragged into a pointless argument. If you have something to say, just get to the point. Stop beating around the bush. Ethan hesitated for a moment before continuing. Autumn feels deeply ashamed about what happened last night. She's overcome with guilt and keeps saying she wants to die. I stared at him blankly and asked, Is she dead yet? Ethan was visibly stunned, his expression one of disbelief. It took him a moment to stammer out. Susan, how can you be so cold-blooded? Cold-blooded? I echoed. People who genuinely want to die don't announce it to everyone. Only those putting on a show pull stunts like that. My words left Ethan speechless. He stared at me, searching my face as though he didn't recognize me anymore. Susan, you seem like a completely different person. Is that so? Or perhaps it's you who has changed. I countered. I haven't. I've always been the same with you. Ethan insisted. I let out another laugh, one devoid of warmth. His words were absurd. Gone was the worshipful, infatuated woman I once was now. My face showed only impatience. Realizing that further arguing was pointless, Ethan moved on to his true agenda. Autumn is overwhelmed with shame and says she doesn't have the face to stay here any longer. She wants to leave. But where could she go? She's just a young woman with her little sister. I felt bad for her, so I thought of a compromise. I remained silent, merely staring at him, waiting. Seeing that I didn't interrupt, Ethan hesitated briefly before continuing. We're about to get married soon. Once we're married, you won't need to attend college. So, why not let Autumn take your spot? She could really use the opportunity. I burst into laughter, the sound sharp and biting. Is this your idea? Or did Autumn suggest it? It's mine, he said firmly. I see, I replied, my tone turning icy. And why should I agree to that? What gives you the right to make decisions for me? Who do you think you are? We're engaged, aren't we? Your business is my business, he argued. Let me stop you right there. I interrupted. We aren't married yet. Even if we were, my life is still none of your business. You're the one who made a mistake. Why should I have to pay for it? For all I know, this so-called compromise could be something you and Autumn schemed up to manipulate me. Ethan's face turned red with anger. How can you say that about me? I'm your fiancé. Not for long, I replied curtly. Once the engagement is broken, you won't be my fiancé anymore. Ethan froze, clearly shocked. What do you mean? Are you saying you want to break off our engagement? Why? Why? I repeated, my voice laced with sarcasm. You brought another woman into our home, cared for her like she was your responsibility, and even ended up in bed with her. If you two are so in love, why not just be together? I'll step aside and let you have her. Ethan vehemently denied any romantic involvement with Autumn. You're spouting nonsense. It's not what you think. I've told you before. My wife will only ever be you. There will never be anyone else. I stared at him like he was a clown putting on a pathetic performance. His face flushed red with frustration, and he practically shouted, Susan, you've always listened to me before. Whatever I said, you do. Why can't you consider my feelings this time? I scoffed at his shamelessness. He had known how deeply I loved him, yet he had still hurt me so cruelly in the past. How could he be so despicable, so utterly without shame? In my previous life, I had been foolish to the point of no return. Now, I had no intention of being that foolish again. I didn't want to hear Ethan Walker continue his nonsense. If you're asking me to give my college spot to Autumn White, forget it, I said firmly. Tell her to give up that ridiculous idea. If she wants to attend college, let her earn it herself. Hoping to steal someone else's place? Shameless. I deliberately raised my voice as I said this, knowing full well that Autumn and Tina White were likely eavesdropping from the next room. The audacity of these two. They made mistakes and expected me to compensate for them? And now they were eyeing my hard-earned college spot? Where did they get the nerve? I shoved Ethan out of my room and went back to packing my belongings. As I organized my things, a chilling thought struck me. Ethan and Autumn seemed far too comfortable suggesting she'd take my place in college, as if they'd done this before. Could it be that, in my past life, Autumn had secretly replaced me in college after I married Ethan? Why else would they come up with such an idea so readily? Could Ethan have been complicit in this all along? Had they been scheming to take my spot from the very beginning? The thought sent shivers down my spine. If that were true, my previous life was even more pitiful than I had imagined. I needed to leave immediately. I grabbed my packed bags, determined to walk out and never look back. But Ethan blocked the doorway. He stood there, arms spread wide, refusing to let me leave. Susan, where are you going? He demanded. I'm moving out. I replied curtly. I won't allow it, Ethan said, his voice firm. You're not leaving. This isn't your decision to make. I shot back. I am leaving. Susan, is this because of Autumn? I told you, there's nothing between us. I know you've been hurt, but I'll make things right. I'll have Autumn move out, and I'll cut ties with her completely. Ethan promised. His words stunned me. Was he truly so desperate to keep me here just to secure my college spot for Autumn? What was his end game? I couldn't figure him out. When I insisted on leaving, Ethan's tone grew sharp. You're my fiancé. Everyone knows that. If you move out, no one will dare take you in. This would be seen as breaking a military marriage, and you could go to jail. Do you understand that? Ethan was right. He was a major, and our engagement was public knowledge. If I left and this escalated into a scandal, I'd be the one bearing the brunt of the consequences. No one would risk taking me in. Swallowing my anger, I returned to my room, biding my time. It wasn't worth the risk. I just needed to endure this for a little longer. 10 more days, and I'd leave for college. Once I was gone, I would never return. But the thought of staying left me uneasy. A terrible suspicion crept into my mind. If Ethan and Autumn had their sights set on my college spot, they wouldn't stop scheming. Was that why Ethan was so adamant about keeping me here? I couldn't let my guard down. I needed to be cautious and prepared. While I steeled myself, Ethan was sent on a mission. Leaving the house, without him around, Autumn came to me directly. She no longer pretended to be innocent or meek. Instead, she approached me with blunt determination. Susan Long, let's not beat around the bush, Autumn said as soon as she stepped into my room. You know that Ethan almost ruined me that night. If you don't want your fiancé to end up in jail, you'd better give up your college spot. I smirked, unbothered by her threats. You're speaking too softly. Say it louder. Let everyone hear. I'm not joking, she said, her tone serious. You know how big of a scandal this could be. If I go to the police, Ethan will be arrested for attempted rape. His career, his entire life, will be over. You love him so much, don't you? Would you really stand by and watch him go to jail? Then go ahead and report it to the police, I said with a faint smirk. my tone laced with mockery. Whether it's a case of assault or solicitation, the police will draw their own conclusions. I leaned back, casually studying Autumn White's flushed face. Let me remind you, the police aren't like Ethan Walker. They won't fall for your tricks or be swayed by your tears. If you end up accused of something like prostitution, you'll be the one making everyone laugh. Autumn's face turned a deeper shade of red, her embarrassment unmistakable. Susan Long, are you sure you want to go head-to-head with me like this? I let out a soft chuckle, watching her as her confidence wavered. She softened her tone, clearly trying a different tactic. I'm not trying to take Ethan from you. Honestly, I don't need to. Ethan already has feelings for me, with just a crook of my finger. He'd leave you for me. Then go ahead and crook your finger at him. I said dryly. Why are you here talking to me about it? I couldn't care less. You're impossible to talk to, she snapped. I told you, I'm not fighting you over Ethan. All I'm asking for is your college spot. You're about to get married anyway, and you won't need it. Giving it to me would be the best solution for everyone. Since you think marrying Ethan is such a great deal, then go ahead and marry him. Don't bring your nonsense to me. I'm not your parent, and I'm not going to spoil you. If you're hoping to get my college spot, let me save you the trouble. It's never going to happen. I stared her down, my voice firm and deliberate. If you're so determined to report Ethan, the police station is 500 meters to the left as you exit the gate. I'll be waiting for the good news. Autumn stormed off in frustration, realizing she couldn't manipulate me. But I knew her well enough to be certain that she wouldn't give up so easily. Living under the same roof as the White sisters kept me on constant alert. I hid my college acceptance letter by sewing it into the lining of one of my clothes and stashed my money carefully. There was no way I would give them even the slightest opportunity to sabotage me. Time passed quickly, and Ethan returned from his mission. To my surprise, he had arranged for a place for Autumn to live, but she outright refused to move. She continued pretending to be ill, clinging to the house and putting on dramatic displays of wanting to die. It was the classic easy to invite in, hard to send away situation. Whether it was a calculated ploy between the two or just Autumn's stubbornness, I couldn't be sure. Either way, it wasn't my problem. I was counting down the days until I could leave. Every day, Ethan spent time with Autumn, holding hushed conversations behind closed doors. Whenever he emerged, his face was seasoned with frustration, clearly under pressure. It didn't take much to guess that their biggest concern was still my college spot. I remained calm and unbothered, which seemed to convince Ethan that I had given up on leaving. His attitude toward me shifted dramatically. Suddenly, he was showering me with kindness, buying me my favorite desserts, inviting me for walks and chats, even suggesting we watch movies together. These were the things I had once yearned for. But now, I rejected them all without hesitation. Who knew what schemes he might have up his sleeve for Autumn's benefit? I wasn't going to fall into his traps again. Meanwhile, Autumn's supposed illness escalated. Ethan had to take her to the hospital multiple times. Yet the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with her. After much fuss, she'd always end up back home, her dramatics unchanged. I could see Ethan's growing irritation. His plans to secure my college spot for Autumn weren't going as he'd hoped, and it was clear he was getting desperate. I was certain that Ethan and Autumn were plotting their next move, determined to corner me somehow. My suspicions were confirmed when Ethan came to me, complaining about Autumn's refusal to leave. What now? Ethan Walker asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Obviously, nothing to do with me, I replied, shrugging indifferently. If I'd known this would happen, I wouldn't have wasted my sympathy on them in the first place. Ethan sighed, still unwilling to let the matter drop. Susan, why don't you just give Autumn your college spot? If you do that, she'll probably move out. As expected, they were still fixated on my college opportunity. At this point, I couldn't outright refuse anymore. Continuing to deny them might escalate things further, and I didn't have the energy to keep dealing with their schemes. I needed to stay calm and keep my focus on leaving. Let me think about it, I said, feigning hesitation. The moment I relented, Ethan's expression softened. He grabbed my hand and, with a heartfelt tone, promised, Susan, I'll take good care of you. You can trust me. I'll be good to you for the rest of my life. Once we're married, You can stay home and take care of the kids. And I'll provide for you forever. As he clasped my hand, nausea churned in my stomach. His idea of being good to me was making me a servant in my own home, while he secretly pursued Autumn. And now, knowing his true character, every word he spoke only disgusted me more. Ethan and Autumn were equally shameless. Their deceit and manipulation cut from the same cloth. I knew I couldn't win against them in a direct confrontation, and I wasn't going to keep tangling with these two despicable people. There was no point in fighting them. It'd only leave me sick with frustration, like being bitten by a rabid dog. Instead, I decided to leave earlier than planned, to keep Ethan appeased. I pretended to agree. I assured him that after we got married, I'd give my college spot to Autumn. He seemed to believe this was my way of forcing him into marriage. And in his eagerness to settle everything, he even offered to move the wedding date up. I watched his busy preparations with cold detachment. I knew there would be no wedding. In my previous life, Ethan had delayed our marriage due to an urgent mission assignment, and I expected the same thing to happen this time. 2 days passed, and just as I anticipated, Ethan was called away on another mission. Before leaving, he pulled me aside for one last conversation. "Susan, you're the one I care about," he said, trying to sound sincere. "I've already submitted the paperwork for our marriage application." To prove his point, he even showed me the application. "Don't cause any trouble while I'm gone. Just wait at home for me to return, and we'll get married." Feigning excitement, I agreed. "Of course, Ethan, I'll submit the application for you. Don't worry. Just focus on your mission." Relieved, Ethan handed me the paperwork, clearly thinking he'd reassured me. The moment he left, I tore the application into pieces and tossed it into a filthy storm drain. After Ethan departed, I wasted no time heading to the train station to buy my ticket. When I returned, Autumn greeted me with a cold smile. "When are you finally going to give me your college spot?" I met her smirk with one of my own. "Why are you in such a rush?" Autumn's frustration was palpable. "How can I not be? The semester is about to start. I need to get my documents, finish the paperwork, and prepare everything. There's no time left. Just give it to me now. Keep dreaming." I shot back. "You'll get it when Ethan comes back from his mission." Autumn's composure cracked. Her irritation was visible, and it was clear she was starting to panic. That night, my stomach began to hurt, so I got up to use the restroom. On my way back, I noticed the light in the White sisters' room was still on. Curious, I paused outside their door. It was so late, yet they were still awake. What were they plotting? As the saying goes, be wary of others' intentions. While I had no desire to harm anyone, I couldn't let my guard down either. Worried about their schemes, I quietly crept closer to eavesdrop. To my shock, I overheard something that left me stunned. Autumn White was angrily scolding Tina White. "Didn't you say she'd willingly give up her college spot for me? Why hasn't anything gone according to your plan?" "How would I know?" Tina retorted, exasperated. "In the last life, she gave up college on her own just so she could marry Ethan Walker. He didn't even need to lift a finger, and the spot was handed over to you. But this time, she's completely unyielding. It's unbelievable." My heart skipped a beat. Tina was also reborn? After a brief silence, Autumn spoke, her voice cautious. "Have you noticed how much Susan Long has changed?" Tina replied, "Of course I have. In the last life, she was like a servant, dutiful, flattering, and constantly trying to please us. She took care of everything for us and followed Ethan's every word. But this time, she's indifferent to us and even cold toward Ethan." Autumn's voice suddenly rose in pitch. "Could it be? Could she also have been reborn? Is that possible?" Tina asked skeptically. "It has to be," Autumn said with conviction. "There's no other way to explain Susan's change." "Then what do we do now?" Tina asked, her tone laced with anxiety. "If Susan remembers what happened in the last life, she'll never let us get away with it. Getting her to hand over the college spot will be nearly impossible." Autumn's voice dropped, but the malice in her words was unmistakable. "We need to find a way to force her. One way or another. She must give me her spot." Hearing the sinister determination in her voice sent chills down my spine. I silently retreated to my room, my mind racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The realization that Tina was also reborn, combined with Autumn's ruthless resolve, left me on edge. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. It was time to leave. No point delaying. Tomorrow, I would be gone. The next morning, I woke with an uneasy feeling. My right eyelid kept twitching. A bad omen, according to superstition. To prevent any surprises, I called for reinforcements. I enlisted help from the neighbors in the adjacent courtyard. Mrs. Zhang, Mrs. Shen, Ms. Li, Aunt Wu, and Granny Wang. The White sisters never expected me to involve others. When they saw 5 or 6 people bustling into the house to help me move my things, they were dumbfounded. Autumn stammered. What? What's going on? Why are you moving? Who are these people? Mrs. Zhang didn't hesitate to retort. I'm here to help Susan move. Unlike you, who seem desperate for her to leave so you can have the place to yourself. A single woman shamelessly living in another woman's fiancé's house. Everyone knows what you're up to, Granny Wang added, her voice loud and unfiltered. Exactly. Do you think no one sees through your little schemes? You've got some nerve. Autumn's face turned an angry shade of red, but she couldn't come up with a single rebuttal. Once all my belongings were loaded onto the truck, I noticed the barely contained rage in the sisters' eyes. I knew they wouldn't sit still. They were bound to make their final move today. With everything packed, I boarded the truck, ready to leave. Just as the vehicle started, I heard Tina's voice shouting from upstairs. Susan, you left something behind. It's your parents' photo. I found it under the bed. My heart clenched. I held my parents' belongings dear. And the White sisters knew this. They had deliberately targeted my weakness, knowing I wouldn't leave without the photos. Of course, I would have to go upstairs to retrieve them. I knew that going upstairs would lead to nothing short of chaos. If they were this eager, then I might as well give them what they wanted and play along. All right, I'll come up and get it, called out. Stairs. Both Autumn and Tina White's faces were filled with tension. Do you think she'll actually come up? Tina whispered, her voice low and worried. She will. Autumn replied confidently. I've heard that she treasures her parents' belongings as if they were gold. The other day, when you tore one of the photos, she was so furious. She won't leave without it. All right then, Tina said hesitantly. But make sure to go easy on me. Don't really hurt me. Okay. Relax. Autumn reassured her. I know what I'm doing. As they spoke, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from downstairs. She's really coming, Tina said, exchanging a triumphant glance with her sister. Both their faces lit up with anticipation, their eyes glued to the staircase. The footsteps approached the bottom of the stairs, then paused. Suddenly, my voice called out, I won't come up. Just toss it down to me. This wasn't part of their plan. Autumn and Tina panicked. Tina raised her voice, trying to coax me. I'm right here at the top of the stairs. Just come up and get it. I hesitated audibly, my silence making them anxious. Autumn grew desperate. Time wasn't on their side, and if I sensed their trap, I wouldn't come up, and their plan would fall apart. She needed to act quickly. Peeking down, Autumn spotted someone at the bottom of the stairs. The figure was wearing red, the same color I was wearing that day. Confident it was me, she didn't even pause to confirm further. Autumn pushed Tina forcefully, shouting, Susan Long, what are you doing? Why are you pushing my sister? Somebody help. My sister is being pushed down the stairs. Tina let out a piercing scream as she tumbled down the staircase. With a sickening thud, her body hit the floor, landing on a pile of exposed steel rods meant for clothes drying. One of the rods impaled her lower body, piercing clean through. Blood sprayed everywhere, painting the scene in horror. Tina's screams were gut-wrenching, filled with unbearable pain. Hearing the commotion, neighbors rushed inside. Stairs. Autumn came barreling down the stairs, shouting hysterically, Susan Long, you heartless monster. If anything happens to my sister, I won't let you get away with it. She reached the bottom of the stairs and froze in her tracks. The sight before her was nightmarish. Tina lay unconscious, her body drenched in blood, the steel rod still lodged through her. Autumn's eyes widened in disbelief. Tina! Tina! She screamed, shaking as her voice broke. Yet her shock was fleeting. Gritting her teeth, she turned to the onlookers, her tone venomous. This is all Susan Long's doing. She pushed my sister down the stairs. You all saw it. Tell the police the truth." A cold laugh came from the doorway. "What did I do?" Autumn turned toward the voice and froze, her face overtaken by shock. There I stood, completely unharmed, calmly leaning against the doorframe. I hadn't gone inside at all. The figure they had mistaken for me wasn't me. Their entire setup had backfired spectacularly. She turned his head and froze at the sight of Mrs. Lee trembling beside him, wearing a red jacket similar to mine. Autumn White let out a blood-curdling, despairing scream. When Tina White was rushed to the hospital, she was barely clinging to life. The steel rod had pierced her lower body, going straight through her abdomen. It was reported that her uterus had been severely damaged. The doctors worked tirelessly for an entire day and night to save her, but she remained on life support. Whether she would survive was still uncertain. Autumn collapsed to the ground in shock. Initially, she tried to frame me for the incident. However, with numerous witnesses and solid evidence proving I hadn't even entered the house, her accusations fell apart. Her entire plan had backfired. With Tina unconscious, Autumn became the sole witness to what had happened. First, she attempted to maintain her lie, but my alibi forced her to backtrack. She had no choice but to claim she had been mistaken. Her inconsistent statements drew suspicion from the police. But as Tina's only close relative, they couldn't find a motive for her to harm her sister. The investigation would have to wait until Tina regained consciousness. Autumn was eventually allowed to return home, but she knew her chances of getting my college spot were now impossible. Yet, she wasn't ready to accept failure. She needed a new plan and a new opportunity. Tina had told her that in their previous life, Ethan Walker rose to prominence, achieving a high-ranking position and a life of ease. That was true. Autumn decided she had to secure her hold on Ethan. She couldn't afford to lose. A week later, late in the evening, Ethan returned from his mission. Parking his car at the gate, he hurried into the house, calling out my name. "Susan, Susan, I'm back." There was no answer. Ethan ran upstairs, noticing that the lights were on, a clear sign someone was home. He assumed I was in the room. But as he turned the corner at the top of the stairs, Autumn burst out of the bedroom, completely naked, and flung herself into his arms. Before Ethan could even process what was happening, several people entered the house. They walked in on Ethan and Autumn locked in an embrace, both stark naked. Ethan was utterly stunned, surrounded by onlookers. He instinctively looked around for me, calling out frantically, "Susan, Susan, where are you? Come out." Autumn coldly replied, "There's no need to call her. Susan Long has already left for college. She's been gone for days." "What?" Ethan asked, his face pale. "Why did she leave? She was supposed to marry me. We submitted the marriage application. She's gone," Autumn said with finality, grabbing hold of Ethan. "And you're here with me now. You've taken advantage of me. Ethan, you owe me an explanation. I didn't touch you. Why should I explain anything?" Ethan protested, still in disbelief. But it wasn't up to him anymore. The people who had caught them weren't strangers. They were Autumn's uncle, aunt, and an assortment of extended relatives. This was a carefully orchestrated trap, with so many witnesses catching them in such a compromising situation. Ethan's denials were useless. Ethan had just returned from his mission, with a promotion to colonel on the horizon. But Autumn and her relatives unanimously threatened him. Either marry Autumn, or they would report him for misconduct, ruining his career and reputation. Ethan didn't want to end things like this. He remembered his past life, where he had risen to great heights. He couldn't let everything fall apart now. For the sake of his future, Ethan reluctantly chose to appease the situation. He agreed to marry Autumn, knowing he had no other option. Their wedding was hastily arranged, and the next day they filed the necessary paperwork, officially becoming husband and wife. But in Ethan's heart, resentment festered. This wasn't the future he had envisioned for himself. Ethan Walker had never planned to marry Autumn White. In his past life, his wife had always been me, Susan Long. How had things changed so drastically this time around? He couldn't understand it. Helping Autumn and her sister had never been about romance. It was purely a debt of gratitude. Autumn's older brother had once saved Ethan's life. In Ethan's previous life, he believed Autumn's account of her brother's death and how she and Tina had been mistreated by their relatives. Living in misery, driven by guilt and obligation, Ethan had tried to save the White sisters from their dire circumstances. In his memory, everything had gone smoothly in his past life. I, deeply in love with him, willingly gave up my college opportunity to marry him. Ethan had turned around and handed my spot to Autumn. She graduated from college and became his secretary at the military base, providing meticulous care for him. Their harmonious relationship had been a given. When he was reborn, Ethan's first thought had been to rescue Autumn earlier so she could lead a better life. He had assumed everything would unfold as it had before. But to his shock, nothing was going as expected. I had left him. Autumn, once seemingly gentle and considerate, now revealed a manipulative and greedy nature that repulsed him. While Ethan grappled with his failed plans, I was already far away, starting a new chapter of my life in the capital city. I took my household registration records with me, severing any remaining ties to Ethan's world. Though Ethan's parents, Uncle Walker and Aunt Lisa, expressed their continued support, I knew I could only rely on myself. During my time at university, I never contacted Uncle Walker or Aunt Lisa, nor did I respond to the letters they sent. Those 4 years passed quickly as I immersed myself in the world of knowledge, exploring fields I had never touched in my previous life. After graduation, I applied for work in a remote, challenging region, dedicating myself to serving my country. 10 years flew by. Hard work paid off, and I returned with honors and a sense of accomplishment. After the recognition ceremony, I ran into Uncle Walker. It had been a decade since I'd last seen him, and he had aged significantly, now retired. He had attended the ceremony as a guest of honor. Uncle Walker held my hand tightly, his voice filled with pride. "Susan, I never imagined you'd achieve so much. I'm so proud of you." I was genuinely glad to see him and inquired about Aunt Lisa's health. His expression darkened as he sighed heavily. "Lisa is paralyzed." "How did that happen?" I asked, shocked. "It's a long story," he said, his voice heavy with regret. As Uncle Walker recounted the events, he inevitably mentioned Ethan. "It's all because of that foolish boy, Ethan. He brought ruin into our home when he decided to help that white woman." From his account, I learned things I had never bothered to uncover. I had always assumed that Ethan and Autumn's marriage had led to the same success they enjoyed in the previous life. But the reality was far different. Ethan and Autumn did marry, dragging along a half-paralyzed Tina White. Tina, with her temperamental and volatile personality, frequently threw tantrums and broke things at home. Both Uncle Walker and Aunt Lisa disapproved of the marriage, but there was little they could do. Autumn held a secret over Ethan's head, using it to manipulate him at every turn. Ethan, weighed down by the constant threats and pressure, lost his edge. His performance at work faltered, leading to a significant mistake that resulted in a formal reprimand from the military. His once promising career came to a halt, and he was demoted from his colonel position. Seeing no path forward, he left the military and transitioned to civilian life. But his career prospects were bleak. Ethan's frustration turned to frequent arguments with Autumn, and Aunt Lisa, already unhappy with Autumn, decided to mediate. But what she overheard shocked her. An argument between Autumn and Tina, where Tina accused Autumn of pushing her down the stairs, causing her permanent paralysis. Enraged by the truth, Aunt Lisa attempted to report Autumn to the authorities. But Autumn, fearing exposure, pushed Aunt Lisa down the stairs, leaving her severely injured. Believing she had killed Aunt Lisa, Autumn thought she was in the clear. But Aunt Lisa survived, though barely, and Autumn's crimes were eventually exposed. The police arrested Autumn, and she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Meanwhile, Ethan spiraled further into despair, consumed by guilt and self-recrimination. Listening to Uncle Walker's account, I felt a deep sense of pity for Aunt Lisa. In my previous life, she had lived a happy, carefree existence, and it was heartbreaking to see her reduced to this state. As for Ethan, I felt nothing but indifference. Everything he suffered was the result of his own choices. As the saying goes, evil begets evil, and good reaps good. Ethan's fall from grace and Autumn's punishment were proof that one's actions eventually catch up to them. It's always better to live with integrity, because no matter how long it takes, justice will find its way.